This is a difficult story for many reasons, and I need you to know that up front before we even begin. The details of this story are going to be very hard to hear. What happened to the young black girl at the center of this story is horrific, and I won't pretend otherwise. So please, take a moment, embrace yourself. But as bad as what happened to this young black girl I'm going to tell you about, what's even more shocking is what happened afterwards. Because what happened after, you literally will not believe. And I can say that because I did not believe it at first. And that's why I chose this story to open our new series, Black Resistance. This series isn't just about what was done to us. It's about how we responded, how black communities resisted injustice, and the cost that came with that resistance. Every story in this series will ask you to carry something heavy. Not just emotionally heavy, but historically heavy and morally heavy. These aren't random cases. We're building something here. Story by story, pattern by pattern, so that by the end, you'll see what black resistance really looked like and what was done to silence it. As I said a few moments ago, this story won't be easy to hear, but it's one that we must carry, one that we must tell. And I don't say this very often, but I'm asking you to stay with me through this entire video. You're going to go through a range of emotions in this story. You'll be horrified. Many of you will feel angry. And I have to be honest with you. Some of you may feel sick learning what happened. But remember, as hard as this story is to hear, imagine enduring it. And that's why we have to tell it. So I'm encouraging you to stay with me throughout this story. Not for me, but for the black people who lived it and died with it. Before we step into this story, I want to offer you some context for where we're headed. Over the past year, we've told a lot of stories. And if you've been with me on this journey, you've heard me say this before, that these stories aren't just about history. They're about memory. They're about what life was like for black people in this country and how injustice has shaped black life today. That's why we created the Memory Justice Project, to remember what some have tried to erase, to recover the stories that tell our story. One of the things I often ask you to do is to step outside of the version of black history that so many of us were taught. The one that frames our struggle in 4 acts. Rosa Parks sat down. Black people marched. Dr. King gave a speech, and then we got rights. But our story is far more expansive than that. It's much deeper. And it didn't happen in 4 acts. It happened every single day in the lives of millions of black people who breathed injustice and tasted brutality. And in a lot of the stories we've covered so far, I've tried to show you something. That black people resisted. We resisted what was done to us. We did not sit quietly. Now notice what I said. I didn't say we won. I said we resisted. Sometimes their resistance was quiet. Sometimes it was loud. But it was always there. This Black Resistance series is designed to push you a little bit more, to help you think differently about what it means when black people resisted. Not from a win-loss perspective, because when it comes to injustice against black people, you have to redefine what winning even means. This series isn't about how we won. It's about how we made it through. Because to get to the other side of through, you have to survive. And you can't survive if you don't endure. And you can't endure if you don't resist. And that brings us to the story I want to tell you about today. Now let me tell you about the black family involved in this tragedy. Lula Sherman was born around 1850 in South Carolina. He was married to a woman named Delia Dupree. She was born around 1855, also in South Carolina. It's likely that they both experienced enslavement, based on the fact that they were born over a decade before slavery ended and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. They were born in a state that fought hard to preserve the evil institution. If you recall your American history, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union in 1860, making it clear that it was doing so to preserve slavery. You'll also recall that just 4 years earlier, in 1856, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks beat Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner over the head with a cane, right there in the Senate chamber, after Sumner gave an anti-slavery speech. Now, that's an important detail to keep in mind because it tells you something about the environment that Cato and Delia were born into. An environment filled with hatred. Hatred for them. Hatred for their freedom. and hatred for their very existence. Slavery wasn't just a period in history. It was a time in which real black people lived and labored and languished under the lash of oppression. And when we came out of slavery, our enslavers didn't welcome us with open arms. Anger, more oppression, and more brutality awaited us. In a previous video, I talked about how for black people, our story has always been one of survival, but we survived, but injustice still came for us. And that's Cato and Delia's story. Survival, followed by the but. They survived slavery, but horror and tragedy were lurking around the corner. Despite living in a world that was doing everything it could to see them fail, Cato and Delia pressed on. They had their first child in 1870, a boy named George. They had a little girl named Lula in 1873. The two were going to have 17 children. By the 1880s, the Sherman family was living like most black people in South Carolina. The 1880 census shows the family living in Central, that's in Pickens County. Cato was a sharecropper on G.W. Miller's land, and Delia was a housekeeper. They were surviving, no longer in bondage, but still surrounded by injustice. Then came December of 1887. This was the holiday season, a time for family, for celebrating, for being merry. That's what the season was supposed to be. But for black people, we were never allowed to truly enjoy. Normal wasn't just normal for us. We couldn't simply enjoy the sunrise and the beauty that it beholds. A cool breeze wasn't just refreshing because it came during the sweltering, back-breaking work of picking cotton. And the holidays were not holidays for us. They were just another Tuesday or another Saturday, another day when injustice was still all around. And for black children especially, you learned from an early age that you were not allowed to be children. The black designation always came before your age. And that meant you were subject to brutality, just like the black adults. Black joy had to be guarded because Jim Crow was a thief. He wanted everything from you, including your peace and your joy. And that's what was about to happen to the Sherman family. Jim Crow was about to come for Lula. After this part, the story is going to take a horrific turn, one that will be hard to hear. So I'm giving you a warning right now. Prepare yourself for what you're about to hear. While watching this, you may need to take a breath. You may need to pause. Some of you may even need to stop watching and step away. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. I just ask that you come back. This story is hard, but it's the truth. And hearing the truth doesn't always feel good. It's not always pretty. But truth-telling is necessary. And this truth belongs to Lula and the Sherman family. Now let me tell you what happened. The morning after Christmas, 14-year-old Lula was at home alone. Her father, Cato, had left early that morning, perhaps to go to work or to visit someone. Her mother, Delia, was also gone. She was attending a funeral. Lula was left in charge of her 8-year-old younger sister while her parents were gone. For Lula, I'm sure she didn't think much of it. It was just another Monday. She could have been playing with her sister, or maybe she was doing chores her mother asked her to do. We don't know exactly, but we do know this. The normalcy and mundaneness of that day was about to leave. Lula was about to go through something that is going to shock your conscience. She heard someone approaching the front door. Then she heard a knock. At first she thought it might have been their landlord, G.W. Miller. But when she opened the door, she saw another white man, someone she didn't know. His name was Mance Waldrop. He was 35 years old. Now Waldrop had no dealings with the Sherman family. He wasn't even from Central. He lived a few miles away in Anderson County. Seeing Waldrop standing in front of her, Lula went from nervous to scared and afraid. And rightfully so, because he was a white man that she didn't know, and he was at her home, and her parents were gone. And you have to remember, this is not like someone coming to your door today. Not a solicitor, not someone leaving a flyer. During this time, black people lived in meager and sometimes barely livable accommodations on a white planter's property. There would have been no reason for a white man to come to a sharecropper shack in 1887, unless it was to collect or to lynch. So Waldrop's very presence there meant danger. Lula told Waldrop that her parents weren't home. He said that he would wait for them to get back. He then came into the home, where he was now alone with 14-year-old Lula and her 8-year-old little sister. Lula didn't know what Waldrop wanted and why he was there, but he knew why he was there. He wanted one thing, and that was her. He wanted Lula, this child. She was powerless to say no when he came into the home. He was white and she was black, and this was the 1880s, just 20 years after the end of slavery, when black people were still seen as former property, not individuals with agency. And there was one more thing. Waldrop was armed. We don't know all the details, don't know the words used, don't know the exact sequence of events of what happened next. We only know the brutality that followed. Mance Waldrop violated Lula, and it was brutal, horrific. So bad that after he had completed the act, Lula was in bad condition. She was bleeding a lot, and in an effort to cover up his cowardice and his brutality, Waldrop forced her to swallow some medicine. When that didn't stop the bleeding, he grabbed a handful of cotton and forced it inside of Lula to stop the flow of blood. After that, he put his pants back on, grabbed his weapon, and left. He came out of nowhere and disappeared back into nowhere, leaving behind him only pain and trauma. When I read this part while researching this video, I literally had to stop, get up from my desk, and walk away. I needed a few moments. I don't know everything that happened in that home. I don't know where it took place. Don't know for how long. But what I did read, what I just told you, was enough. Enough to make me feel sick. Enough to make me angry. Enough to make me say, my God, this poor child. Being black in 1887 was hard enough. Every day was a struggle. Breathing and existing while black was practically a crime. But for this child to experience this in her own home, the day after Christmas, exposed the evil nature of racism and injustice. I mean, seriously think about this. This was December 26th, the day after Christmas. And all this man had on his mind was getting a black child. All he was consumed with was deviancy, violating. That's what he got up with on his mind that morning. His sole mission that day was to find a little black girl. Others were still thinking about gifts. Some were looking forward to Christmas leftovers. Mance Waldrop, evil was on his mind. He was consumed with darkness. I hope I'm explaining myself clearly, because I really want you to dial into what I'm saying. This is the insidious nature of injustice and racism. Black people lived in a world where depravity walked alongside hatred, where blackness justified everything done to you. Because you were black, anything done to you could be excused. Because Lula was black, Waldrop felt no need to run from that home after the violation. He walked away. He didn't climb through the window. He didn't drag her into the woods. He didn't wait for darkness. He didn't even care to hide. He carried out this act in full view because Lula was black, and he didn't need to. And then there's Lula, because we cannot forget about her. I'm careful to always say this. These weren't just attacks, weren't just violations. This was a real moment that Lula Sherman experienced. She breathed through every second of it. She felt every ounce of pain. A million thoughts were racing through her head at 1,000,000 miles an hour. What's happening? What is he doing? Please stop. No more. Where is my daddy? I want to leave. Tears left her eyes and dropped to the floor, soaked her clothes. And that was during the violation. When Waldrop walked out of that house, what did he leave Lula with? He accomplished what he wanted, which was to violate. But what about Lula? When she was in that home, along with her sister, what was she thinking? What was she feeling? She didn't know what was happening to her body, She didn't know what to do or where to go. Just a child in pain, in fear, and completely alone. Cato and Delia returned home later that day. Again, we don't have all the details on what happened, but we know this. Lula didn't tell them. She didn't tell them what had happened. Her mother Delia saw that something was off with her daughter. Lula wasn't as talkative as usual. She seemed shaken and upset, but Delia couldn't figure out what was wrong. She tried to get Lula to talk, tried to get her to open up, but Lula didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain what had just happened to her. So she said nothing. She carried the confusion, the pain, the trauma, and the shame that wasn't hers and never should have been, all by herself. She suffered in silence. December 27th came around. Still, nothing. Delia kept asking, kept trying to reach her daughter, but Lula stayed silent. And then something else happened. Lula started getting sick. She had a fever. She wasn't feeling well. 3 days after the attack, the fever worsened. Lula was even more sick. And then her small body started having convulsions. Delia didn't know what was happening. So she sent one of their other children to run 3 miles to town to get the doctor, T.W. Folger. While she waited for the doctor to arrive, that's when Lula finally told her. She told her mother what had happened. On the morning after Christmas, when Delia was at the funeral and Lula was at home, she told her what man's wardrobe had done to her. But by then, the brutality of the violation and the infection that came from the dirty cotton that was still inside of her, it had taken its toll. Lula died, right there in her mother's arms. This child's life, gone, because someone didn't value her, didn't see her as human, only as an object for his use. Dr. Folger arrived and examined Lula's body to determine her cause of death. He found that the violation had been so brutal, it had stolen Lula's life. All he could do was write it down. And let me say this, because I've been reflecting on that moment between Lula and her mother. That last breath, that final heartbeat. And I couldn't stop thinking about Lula's age. 14. In the world, but still learning the world. In my years as an attorney, I've handled lots of cases where people have died tragically, sometimes violently. And in my line of work, you see things, images and videos, moments most people would never want to witness. You see the look in someone's eyes when they know it's the end. In fact, one of the things I often have to prove in a wrongful death case is whether the person experienced pain and suffering in those final moments before they died. And I thought about Lula. She didn't say anything to her parents about what happened. And I'm not focusing on that part right now. What I'm getting at is this. She didn't know. She knew she wasn't feeling well, but she didn't know that her body was shutting down. She didn't know that the pain and the shame she had been carrying in silence was the very thing that was taking her life. And I just wonder, in those final moments, when Delia was holding her, when Lula finally told her mother what happened, did she even realize that the thing she had tried to keep quiet was already screaming through her body? That what had been done to her was stealing her from this world, from her family. And that thought right there, it stayed with me. Now after this story takes a turn, and not one I've talked about before or even contemplated happening. Because what happened next, I never saw it coming. Not the first time I read it, and not the second. What we're about to see is the resistance to what happened to Lula. After Lula died, word spread quickly through the small community. A coroner's jury was quickly assembled to investigate. Ben Garvin, who was a local farmer and also served as a trial justice, was called to act as the temporary coroner. He gathered 14 men, both black and white, to serve as jurors and to determine what happened to Lula. That same day, they met at Tom Watkins' store to begin the proceedings. Cato and Delia came and testified, still in shock from their daughter's death, still reeling from the horror of what had been done to her. They told the jury what little they knew. Dr. Folger also testified. And after hearing from them, the jury confirmed what everyone already knew. Lula died as a result of the violation inflicted upon her. But there was still one question they couldn't answer. Who did it? Without a name, without a suspect, the jury ended proceedings for the day. But they returned the next day to continue their investigation. This time, more people came forward. Neighbors, witnesses, people who had seen things that now took on a new light. Several people recalled seeing a white man in the area near the Sherman home on the morning that Lula was left alone with her little sister. With their help, a timeline began to emerge. G.W. Miller, the family's landlord, he said he was visited by Mance Waldrop around 11 a.m. that morning, December 26. Waldrop inquired about renting property. He also asked permission to hunt on the land. Miller noticed that Waldrop had a weapon but no dog, which struck him as odd. But Miller wasn't the only one who saw him. Two black men who lived nearby, they also testified. They had seen Waldrop leaving the area between 12 and 1 p.m. Another woman, Mary Spearman, who lived on Miller's land, she told the jury that she saw Waldrop walk past her house around noon, headed towards the Shermans. With this information, the jury had their suspect. They knew who did this to Lula Sherman. But knowing, even proving who did it, was no guarantee that justice would follow. Because Mance Waldrop was still a white man. And in the Jim Crow South, a white man violating a black girl wasn't always considered a crime. It was considered just another Monday. So yes, they had a name, but names alone didn't guarantee consequences. Garvin sent men to go and find Waldrop and bring him back to the store. While they were looking for him, Cato, Delia, and their family, they were laying the little girl to rest. Lula was buried that afternoon. And while the investigation was moving fast, I imagine it felt like time had stopped for Delia and Cato. Just days earlier, they were celebrating Christmas, the birth of baby Jesus. And now, they were mourning the death of their baby, who died a horrific death. Songs like Joy to the World that they may have just been singing a day or two before, those songs were far from their minds now. All they could feel was sorrow. Sorrow that their baby was gone, and regret that they weren't there to protect her. But that sorrow was about to turn into anger, into rage, and into vengeance. Waldrop was found and brought back to Central. Lula's 8-year-old sister was brought to the store. She was the only one who had seen Waldrop's face, the only one who knew what he did. She took one look at him and said he was the one who came to their home and hurt her sister. Waldrop denied knowing anything. He said he had nothing to do with Lula's death. After her identification of Waldrop, he was quickly charged with a violation and taken to Lula Sherman's life. But him being in custody, that was only the beginning. Because what happened next completely shocked me. Now, I've talked a lot about Delia and her last moments with Lula, but there was also Cato, Lula's father. And Cato was filled with rage. When he testified before the coroner's jury, his pain and his anger could be felt by everyone who heard him. There wasn't a father within earshot who didn't feel Cato's heartbreak and think about what they would want to do to the man who harmed their baby girl. Because what Cato wanted to do is what they wanted to do. And it was in those moments that plans were already starting to form. Plans to deal with her attacker. Plans to lynch him. Now, I want you to pause for a moment because I need you to hear what I'm saying. Everyone knew that Mance Waldrop was white and Lula was black. The lynching rope in the South, it flowed one way, white hand to black neck. But now, black men were contemplating lynching a white man. And from where they stood, you can see what they might have been thinking. Had Lula been white and Mance had been black, had a white child not even died but just said she was frightened, there would have been no inquest, no testimony, no coroner's jury. The lynching would have happened as soon as the mob got their hands on the black man. And they were right to think this. Black men were lynched with regularity in South Carolina. Some were recorded, many weren't. We will never know how many. In 1871, the Klan lynched a dozen black people in Union County, all arrested, none given a trial, just taken and lynched. And between 1882 and 1887, the very year Lula lost her life, at least 15 black men were lynched in South Carolina for the same thing that Waldrop did to Lula. But this time, it wouldn't be silence or surrender that followed Lula's death. It would be resistance. If the men had their way, the rope was going to go the opposite direction this time. As soon as Waldrop was in custody, people started talking. And what they wanted to do was clear. The anger over what happened to this little black girl, you could feel it in the air. Black people wanted to do something. Something that had always been done to them when something like this happened. A black man named Harrison Hayward, he was at Watkins' store during the coroner's jury's proceedings, and he made it clear what he wanted. He said, Waldrop should be hanged. Now, when I read that, I could not believe it, because everything we know about black history, especially how black people were treated in the South after the end of slavery, says that a comment like that should have never been said. Not out loud, and not in public. A statement like that could get a black person and their entire family lynched. But the fact that Harrison Hayward said it, out loud, in front of others, that tells you just how enraged black people were over Lula's death. A white man, Gaylord Eden, was present when Hayward made his comment about lynching Waldrop. Eden was one of the members of the coroner's jury, and he took note of what Hayward said. After the coroner's inquest, Constable David Garvin made plans for Waldrop to be brought back to the Pickens jail, and he chose Gaylord Eden to help him with the transport. Eden eagerly accepted the request. He had been drinking all that day. He went to secure Waldrop to get him ready to be moved, and as he tied him up, he told Waldrop that the rope would break his neck. Apparently, Eden had heard what Hayward said about lynching Waldrop, and he took it seriously. Eden said several times that they would never make it to the Pickens jail with Waldrop. He had a plan to deal with him. Eden hid a rope under his coat. Then he left Watkins' store, alongside Constable Garvin and Waldrop, and headed towards Central. Once Waldrop was taken away from Watkins' store, that's when the real planning began. The men who remained behind began discussing how they would do it, how they would lynch Waldrop. Lula Sherman, Harrison Hayward, and other black men began to make their plans. But there was one question they still had. Would they get away with it, like the white men so often did? Because mob anger and brutality was nothing without the rule of law back in the mob. That's why white mobs always felt empowered to be rulers of law and not followers of the rule of law. They knew there would be no consequences for enforcing brutality against black people. The system would always back them up. One black man, Bill Williams, asked Tom Watkins what would happen if they hanged Waldrop like white men had done to black men so many times before. Watkins told him it would be like if Watkins took Williams' life. It would be taking the law into his own hands. But Watkins wasn't condemning the idea. He was just stating the obvious. Because after he said that, he gave them something else. He told Bill Williams that whatever they did, make sure a white man wasn't involved. In other words, if you lynch Waldrop, do it by yourselves. You have our approval, but black men need to do it. We won't do it for you. I don't know about you, but I found this part of the story so crazy, and that's really the only word that comes to my mind. Because what I was reading were plans being made to lynch a white man for something he had done to a black girl. And on top of that, other white men were involved in it. In most of the stories that we told you, we don't get the planning. We never know what was said. We know that it was said, and we have a good idea by whom. But when the mob meeting took place, what they said, who asked what, we don't know. We only see the success of their planning, the lynching. But here, we get almost a play-by-play view of what a lynch mob was doing. And the fact that it was a black lynch mob makes this story even more fascinating. Usually, black grief was public, and white violence was hidden. But here, black resistance is laid bare. We're watching it unfold in real time. And let's be clear about something. They weren't planning for pride. They were planning because a child was gone, because Lula was gone. And they knew the system wasn't going to show up for her. How could it? The same system that once enslaved them was never going to protect them. After this, people started talking. Word began to spread around town that a lynching was about to happen. So much so that people tried to talk Constable Garvin and Eden I'd have taken Waldrop to the jail that night. They said it wasn't safe, not with all the talk about him being lynched. One man even offered his own home, said they could keep Waldrop there for the night and guard him until morning. Better that than risk him being on the road with an angry black mob looking for them. But Eaton, he wasn't having it. He wanted to get moving, said he'd walk Waldrop himself to the jail if he needed to. Garvin convinced him to at least wait so that they can get a buggy. That way, they wouldn't have to walk on foot. At the same time, Dr. Folger, the doctor who examined Lula after she died, he warned the two men. He told them there was a mob waiting for them on the main road, and maybe they should take a different route. But Garvin and Eaton said no. They'd take the main road anyway. It was as if they knew what was about to happen, and they were fine with it. And I've got to be honest, because I keep coming back to this part, because it's so interesting to me. I've told you so many stories like this, where law enforcement took a route out in the open when transporting a black person, knowing they'd be stopped by a white mob. But here, it's the opposite. And you have to ask yourself, why would Garvin and Eaton ignore the warnings about a black mob being on the road? Unless they were in on it, or at least okay with whatever was about to happen. Once Garvin got the buggy, the three men set out for the Pickens jail, taking the main road. They got about a mile out when they saw it. Black men started coming out of the darkness and appeared in the road. But at first, it was just a few. Then more appeared. Constable Garvin whipped the mule to go faster. The black men gave chase. Then, out of nowhere, another dozen black men stepped into the road. What Garvin and Eaton had been warned about just moments earlier was now standing right in front of them. And these men didn't come to talk. Then shots rang out. Waldrop was hit in the head, but not fatally. The shot only grazed him. By this time, Dr. Folger and a group of white men had arrived on the scene. They stepped between Waldrop and the black men. And for a moment, it looked like the lynching might be stopped. Waldrop began walking back towards town, trying to get away. But the black men would not be stopped, and they would not take no for an answer. They pushed past Folger and the others and took hold of Waldrop. They then turned to the white men and told them to leave. And that's exactly what they did. They left, turned around, and went the other way, leaving Mance Waldrop with a group of black men. We don't know what happened next. Don't know if they made Waldrop confess. Don't know if he begged for his life. All we know is this. By morning, Mance Waldrop's body was found hanging from a small tree near the road. Reports from that time said that this was the first time in the history of South Carolina that a white man had been lynched by black people for attacking a black girl. There's a lot more to this story, but I want to say this before I move on. Mob justice is not something that should be condoned. It was carried out on us with impunity, and we should not applaud it. But to read about a group of black men braving all that came with what they did here, it truly shocked me. This was not just a lynching. Let's be clear about that. This was black men exercising a sense of agency and control that we rarely see recorded, not since the days of slave rebellions. Black resistance has always been met with overwhelming brutality from the ruling class. But here, these black men said, so what? I don't care. We're doing it anyway. And that was the thing I grappled with as I learned about this story. I kept asking, why and how? Why would they feel they could do this? How did they think this would turn out for them? And did they even care? To be honest, I don't think we'll ever know the answers to those questions. The record simply doesn't say it. But as shocking as this part of the story was, what happens next is even more shocking. After Waldrop was lynched, the coroner once again was called to investigate. But this time, Ben Garvin wouldn't be in charge. Too much had happened. Too much was at stake. District Solicitor James Orr came to Central and took over the investigation himself. The new jury got to work, trying to determine what happened. The jury heard from several black people who had knowledge of what occurred. A black man named Jim Barry Crawford, he told the jury that the men who took Waldrop were Lula Sherman and 3 other black men. Another black man, Andrew Crooks, he told the jury that he overheard Cato and the others making a pact to lynch Waldrop. And a young black man named Lucas Gant, he said that he was told how Waldrop was lynched by Cato and the other black men. After 4 days of hearing testimony, they came to a conclusion. They determined that Mance Waldrop had been lynched by 5 black men. Cato Sherman, Harrison Hayward, Bill Williams, Henry Bolton, and John Reese. But that wasn't all. The jury also found that the men had help from a white man, Gaylord Eaton. He was arrested and charged, but unlike the 5 black men, Eaton wasn't charged with taking Waldrop's life. He was only charged as an accessory before the fact, meaning he was involved in the planning but didn't participate in it. After they were arrested, none of the black men could afford to post their bond, so they remained in jail. Eaton, on the other hand, he had money, and he easily posted the $5,000 bond, and he hired 2 of Pickens County's best attorneys to represent him. The black men, they had no money to do this, so they stayed in jail, waiting to find out if they would ever go home again. For Lula Sherman, that meant that in just a matter of days, she had lost her daughter, and now her husband, the protector of their family, was behind bars. Because Lula Sherman had been charged with the most serious crime a black person could face in the Jim Crow South, taking the life of a white man. And in the eyes of the law, a black man didn't have the right to protect himself, let alone take justice into his own hands. The legal system wasn't built to protect black people. It was built to punish them, to make examples out of them. And history has shown you didn't need a jury or even a fair trial to end a black man's life. All you needed was a white victim and a black defendant. And that was the legal peril that Lula Sherman found himself in. After news spread about what the black man did to avenge Lula's death, support began coming in from all over the region. Newspapers carried headlines about what these men had done, and black people took notice. They wanted to support Cato and the others who stood up for Lula. In Charleston, Samuel J. Lee, a black attorney and former Speaker of the South Carolina House of Representatives during Reconstruction, he rallied support for the 5 men and began raising money for their defense. And then, the men gained an unlikely ally. Prominent Confederate veteran and attorney R.W. Simpson agreed to represent them. But make no mistake, their fight was far from over, because the system wasn't done with them just yet. On January 16, 1888, a grand jury was convened. Once again, Lula Sherman and the other black men were indicted. Gaylord Eaton was also indicted, but this time for the lynching itself, not just as an accessory before the fact. And the list didn't stop there. The grand jury also indicted another black man named Foster Knox. And even more shocking, they believed that Constable David Garvin, Dr. Folger, and 3 other white men were also involved and should have been prosecuted. But only the black men remained in jail. Lula Sherman and the others had to wait behind bars in Pickens County until their trial that summer in July. Before I take you to the trial, I need to tell you one more thing about the grand jury. Because when it met, it didn't just indict. It did something else. Something revealing. Something grotesque. It took time to give its own opinion about how Lula died. Now, up to this point, everyone knew what had happened. It was not disputed. Dr. Folger made it clear, and the coroner's jury knew it. Lula died because of the brutal violation inflicted on her body. But the grand jury, they didn't want to accept that. So they shifted the blame, not to Mance Waldrop, but to Lula Sherman, Lula's mother. The grand jury claimed that Lula didn't die from the violence of a grown white man, but from a sexual disease they said black girls carry. And if that wasn't vile enough, they said that Delia had beaten her daughter so severely that the whipping, not the violation, was what led to her death. Now, if you're shocked by that, you shouldn't be, because what the grand jury said out loud was a belief many people quietly held back then, and still do, that black women cannot be violated, that black girls cannot be victims, that their pain doesn't count, that their deaths don't matter, that they can be used and discarded and blamed. And I'm not just saying that. Newspapers printed it with no shame. They wrote that Lula's death was not a tragedy, but the expected result of a diseased body in a dysfunctional home. The Kiowee Courier, a white-owned paper in the nearby town, published an editorial after Lula's death. And here's what it said: that Lula Sherman was not a victim worth avenging. According to the paper, there are some crimes that warrant the lynching. Crimes like the violation of a white woman. Because they wrote, protecting white womanhood was the hallmark of Anglo-Saxon Christian civilization. But black women, they didn't qualify. The paper said that black women were not respectable. That black people as a race did not value their women the same way whites did. And because of that, there could be no real outrage over what happened to Lula. That was their logic. Lula didn't deserve justice because she was black. Her pain wasn't real. Her life didn't matter. And no one, not even her own people, should have been angry. That was the world that we lived in. That's how they saw our daughters, our mothers, and our sisters. It should make you furious, but it should not surprise you. Because this right here, this denial of black womanhood, was not an exception. It was the rule. The disrespect of black women wasn't a byproduct of Jim Crow. It was a feature of the system. When the July trial came around, before it even began, the charge against Constable Garvin and Dr. Folger had been dismissed. But the charge against the 5 black men and Gaylord Eden, they remained. The courtroom was packed. Practically the entire town came out to see what would happen. White and black people wanted to know, would a jury convict these men for something that white men never faced a court for? Because if they did, if they convicted these black men for a lynching, then the whole system would have to answer for why it never did the same to white men. A guilty verdict wouldn't be justice. It would be a contradiction. And contradiction is dangerous when your power depends on the lie of moral authority. Cato and the other black men all pleaded not guilty. Solicitor Orr called several witnesses, including the young black man, Lucas Gant. Gant told the jury that he overheard Eden saying that the rope would break Waldrop's neck before they made it to Pickens. He also said that Hayward told him that they lynched Waldrop, and then Hayward threatened to harm him if he said anything about him. The defense attorneys called family members to testify and to provide alibis for the accused. And when the testimony ended, the jury went to deliberate. But they couldn't reach a verdict. A mistrial had to be declared. Now, if you've seen our videos before, you should notice a very familiar pattern here, a similar defense. This is exactly what white mobs did when they were finally brought to trial for a lynching. They'd walk into court with a mountain of evidence against them and still walk out free. Friends and neighbors would flood the courtroom to swear where they were and where they weren't, even when the whole town knew that they were a part of that lynching. There could be a mountain of evidence, a clear path to guilt, but somehow the jury would always lose its way. And now we're seeing the same playbook, only this time it was in the hands of black men. Even though a mistrial was declared, the prosecution didn't give up. It tried them in again in March of 1889. The jury heard the same evidence. After deliberating for 4 hours, fears began to spread that another mistrial would occur. Then at around 11 p.m., the jury said it had reached a verdict. Lula Sherman, Gaylord Eden, and John Reese were found not guilty. But the other 3 black men were convicted of Waldrop's lynching. This was the first time anyone had ever been convicted of a lynching in South Carolina, and possibly in the entire country at that time. The verdict was a compromise. Some jurors wanted to find all the men guilty, and others wanted to find them not guilty. So they found half guilty and half not guilty. The jury recommended that the men receive mercy, meaning that they should get life in prison and not death. But the law did not allow for this. There was only one sentence allowed. Judge Joseph Norton sentenced the men to die by hanging. Bolton would later be granted a new trial, but this story, it was still far from over. Because after Judge Norton issued the sentence, a campaign to save these men's lives began almost immediately. Thousands of citizens signed petitions, asking the governor of South Carolina, John Richardson, to pardon the convicted black men. A group of black ministers even met directly with the governor to request clemency. And in Charleston, black people organized a mass meeting to protest the death sentence and to demand action. They didn't just gather though. They printed and passed out over 1,000 leaflets all across the city, calling on black citizens and fair-minded white allies to join them in urging the governor to use his pardon power to spare these black men's lives. It was a coordinated, public appeal from people who believed that what these men did may have broken the law, but it did not betray justice. Governor Richardson delayed the executions while he considered the request. Judge Norton, the same man who sentenced the men to death, wrote the governor personally and said that had the jury known that the men would be hanged, they would have never convicted them in the first place. Another petition pointed out the truth that black people had always known, that no white man had ever been convicted of a lynching in South Carolina. These black men, they said, were simply following the example set by white mobs for decades. Then the governor did what many thought was unthinkable. In 1889, Governor John Richardson granted full and unconditional pardons to the two black men. A group of black men had done the unthinkable and gotten away with it. And not just gotten away with it, the white governor of South Carolina, for all intents and purposes, sanctioned it, said that what they did was not a crime. It was fine. Everyone was to go back to their normal lives. But Lula was still gone, and black girlhood was still seen as disposable. Now, before you think that this was some kind of victory for black people, not so fast. The issue at the core of this lynching was never just about one man. It was about whether lynching was a tool of justice for all or an instrument of white rule. And make no mistake, the South already had its answer. There was a deep dilemma here. White officials didn't want to legitimize the lynching of a white man by black hands, but they also didn't want to set the legal precedent of punishing lynch mobs because that would mean the white lynch mobs could be punished too. And that couldn't happen. This was only 1889. Thousands more black people would be lynched over the next 70 years. That practice had to continue. And if that meant letting 5 black men go free to protect the custom of racial terror, so be it. In Jim Crow's eyes, manslaughter was worth the sacrifice. Jim Crow had more work to do, more lives to ruin, more fear to spread, more black spirit to crush. And he wasn't about to let this case get in the way. Lula Sherman may have walked free, but it wasn't freedom. Because for his family, there was no comfort. His little girl still suffered a horrendous death. And the lynching does not erase the pain of that memory. The Shermans continued to live in South Carolina. Census records show Cato still working as a sharecropper well into his 70s. But I'm sure not a day went by when he didn't think about Lula. Cato died on December 12, 1925, at the age of 75. Delia died 3 years before him, on November 22, 1922, at the age of 67. Lula's story is a hard one to hear, and a hard one to learn about. But we tell a story not to spotlight the injustice, not to sensationalize the outcome. We tell our story to honor her memory. Because, as I said before, memory is a form of justice. The brutality of what happened to Lula was overshadowed by a public debate about who gets to lynch and who doesn't. But we don't tell this story to join the debate. We tell it to return the focus to this little black girl who suffered because of racism, who died because of injustice. We want to restore dignity to her because she mattered. And what happened to her, it mattered. One of the things that was so fascinating to me was not just that a white man was lynched by black men and the black men were pardoned. It was something else. It was the support from black people. And I don't mean that they supported lynching, because I don't think that's what this was. When we think about black protests and black resistance, our minds often jump straight to the 1950s and 1960s. We think about the bus boycotts. We think about the sit-ins. We think about the court battles, those courageous fights that lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley waged to protect the rights of black people under the Constitution. But here, that's not what was being supported, because this wasn't about claiming a constitutional right. Black people had no right to lynch. There was no due process right here, no legal shield to stand behind. Lynching was a form of lawlessness, of vigilante violence. And yet black people still rally behind these men. And I found that to be a powerful juxtaposition, because here we have black people standing up for their rights. But the right they were standing up for was the right to lynch, just like the white man. It was as if they were saying, you stole us from our homeland, but we couldn't stop you. You shackled us in slavery, but we couldn't escape. You codified our dehumanization, said we were less than human, and we had no court to hear our cry. You tore apart our families, sold us like cattle, and we couldn't hold you back. You promised us freedom during Reconstruction, then called it redemption as you rewrote the laws to re-enslave us, and we had nowhere to go. You lynched us without trial, without truth, without proof, and we had no one to turn to. But for Lula, we're going to do something. We're going to do to you what you always said we deserved. Black people used Jim Crow's own rules to call his bluff. They forced him to answer. Was lynching really about protecting women, or was it always about race? And to keep the blueprint intact, to preserve the future of racial control, Jim Crow stood down. Just this once. Because the practice had to continue. The rope still had work to do. And if that meant letting 5 black men go to protect this practice, so be it. Mance Waldrop was worth the sacrifice. We chose this story to open our Black Resistance series because it was different. It took a turn that no one expected, but it also taught us something. It showed us that Jim Crow wasn't just about power. He was about preservation. He would sacrifice even a white man if it meant protecting the larger system. Mance Waldrop committed a horrific crime, and he paid for it with his life. But not because it was justice. Not because the system believed that black girls should be defended. No. He was sacrificed because the plan had to continue. The plan to tear down, to denigrate, to terrorize, to inflict maximum brutality on black life and black dignity. Avenging Mance Waldrop wasn't worth interrupting that. The blueprint of injustice was too important to Jim Crow's survival. This series is designed to show you what black resistance looked like and how the system responded to it. And that's exactly where we're going next. But before we do, I want to hear from you. What stayed with you about Lula Sherman's story? And what made you stop and reflect? Drop your thoughts in the comments for me. And if you value the work that we're doing through our Memory Justice Project, we'd love for you to partner with us. You can become a member of our Patreon community and help keep this work going. Just visit the link in the description to learn more. I'll see you in the next video.